February 15, 1946. The University of Pennsylvania's Moore School of Electrical Engineering hums with an electric anticipation. Outside, a biting winter wind whips through West Philadelphia. But inside, the atmosphere crackles with a different kind of energy. Dignitaries in dark suits, military brass adorned with medals, and a phalanx of eager journalists jostle for position. Today, the world is about to meet the electronic numerical integrator and computer, ENIAC, a monolithic marvel, America's secret weapon against the tyranny of manual calculation, now revealed to a public hungry for post-war innovation. Newspapers scream headlines the next morning. Giant brain unveiled. Electronic monster solves impossible problems. Hailing its male creators, J. Presper Eckert and John Mockley, as visionary engineers, the intellectual architects of the digital age. Photographers capture triumphant smiles, firm handshakes, and the awe of a nation stepping into a future previously confined to science fiction. The images are stark, rows of impressive men confidently gesturing towards the labyrinthine panels and blinking lights of the monumental machine. Yet, in every official photograph, every breathless press release, and every glowing article that cemented ENIAC's place in history, 6 brilliant minds, the very women who had spent months, often years, teaching this brain to think, to calculate, are conspicuously, disturbingly missing. The sheer scale of the ENIAC itself was breathtaking. Weighing 30 tons, occupying 1,800 square feet, and containing nearly 18,000 vacuum tubes, 70,000 resistors, and 10,000 capacitors, it consumed 150 kilowatts of power, enough to dim the lights in entire sections of Philadelphia when it fired up. Its purpose was equally immense, to rapidly calculate ballistic firing tables for the U.S. Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground, a task that until then had been performed by human computers, mostly women, with desk calculators, a process so slow and laborious that it often took longer to calculate a trajectory than it did for a shell to reach its target. ENIAC promised to compress weeks of work into minutes, fundamentally altering the pace of warfare and, implicitly, the future of science and engineering. The public unveiling was a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to impress and to claim American technological supremacy. The narrative was clear: men invented, men built, men operated. The scientists and engineers, all male, spoke eloquently of circuits, logic gates, and the revolutionary potential of their creation. They were hailed as heroes, their names etched into the nascent history of computing. But where were the individuals who translated the complex mathematical equations of ballistics into the machine's intricate language? Who were the silent architects of its operational logic, the ones who meticulously connected thousands of wires and set countless switches, transforming a gargantuan assemblage of hardware into a functioning problem-solving entity? The contrast was jarring, almost insulting. The machine, a testament to human ingenuity, stood as the star. The men who conceived its hardware were its celebrated fathers. But the women who breathed intellectual life into it, who conceived its software before the term software even existed, were relegated to the background, if they appeared at all. Sometimes they were mistaken for models posing next to the machine, or simply dismissed as refrigerator ladies, part of the scenery, not the substance. This wasn't merely an oversight. It was an act of erasure, a deliberate sidelining of intellectual labor deemed less significant because of who performed it. The visual evidence from that day, preserved in countless archives, tells a story of triumph, but also of profound injustice. It showcases the birth of a technological revolution, but simultaneously the burial of the true pioneers of programming. The emotional stakes were high, though perhaps not immediately apparent to the public. For the women involved, Kay McNulty, Jennings, Snyder, Marlyn Wescoff, Fran Bilas, and Ruth Lichterman, this public spectacle must have been a bitter pill. They had worked under immense pressure, often around the clock, in a classified environment, contributing intellectual insights that were as crucial as the physical construction of the machine. They had debugged its temperamental vacuum tubes, navigated its bewildering architecture, and developed foundational programming techniques that would shape the entire field. Yet, on this day of global recognition, their contributions were not just unacknowledged, they were actively rendered invisible, airbrushed from the historical frame. The world celebrated a machine, a giant brain, but who truly made this brain compute, giving it the instructions, the algorithms, the very Sowetas that allowed it to perform its astonishing feats? And why was their genius so systematically obscured at the very moment of its greatest triumph? To answer that profound question of who truly made the ENIAC compute and why their contributions vanished, we must step back from the glare of that 1946 unveiling and delve into the classified, high-stakes world of wartime necessity that birthed ENIAC. The women we're discussing, Kay McNulty, Jennings, Snyder, Marlyn Wescoff, Fran Bilas, and Ruth Lichterman, were not simply clerical staff as the prevailing narrative often implied. They were computers, brilliant mathematicians, many with degrees in mathematics or physics, recruited by the U.S. Army during World War II to perform the grueling, error-prone task of calculating ballistic trajectories by hand. They were the human engines of computation, their minds trained to execute complex equations with precision and speed, even if those speeds were glacial by mechanical standards. When the ENIAC project began in secret at the Moore School in 1943, these women were not brought in to merely end the finished machine. They were tasked with a monumental, intellectually demanding challenge: to program it. This was an unprecedented undertaking. There were no programming languages, no operating systems, no compilers, no user manuals. The very concept of software was yet to be fully articulated. They were handed blueprints of the machine's hardware and told to make it work, to translate abstract mathematical problems into the physical configuration of thousands of switches, cables, and patch panels. They didn't just operate it, they computed its logic, manually wiring thousands of switches and cables, translating complex algorithms into machine language, effectively becoming the first software engineers. Their work was intensely intricate, requiring a profound understanding of both mathematics and the machine's architecture. Imagine a room-sized digital circuit board. To program ENIAC, these women had to physically connect its 40 panels, each with hundreds of wires and switches to direct the flow of data and instructions. They worked with flowcharts, pioneering this visual representation of program logic to map out the sequence of operations. They had to understand the machine's internal workings at a fundamental level, identifying which circuits to activate, which storage units to use, and how to route numbers through its accumulators to perform calculations. A single ballistic trajectory might require 2,400 multiplications, and each step had to be precisely wired. Debugging was a nightmare, akin to finding a single faulty light bulb in a house with 18,000 bulbs. A flickering vacuum tube, a loose connection, an incorrectly set switch could send the entire calculation awry. They developed ingenious methods for isolating errors, for systematically checking connections, and for reusing segments of code, essentially inventing the concept of subroutines. Their intellectual contribution was immense, laying the very groundwork for what we now understand as software engineering. They were problem solvers of the highest order, translating abstract thought into tangible machine action. Kay McNulty, for example, was instrumental in developing the master program for the ENIAC, allowing it to perform sequences of operations without constant manual intervention. Snyder and Marlyn Wescoff became expert debuggers, their keen eyes and logical minds essential to getting the temperamental machine to function reliably. Fran Bilas and Ruth Lichterman tackled the complex task of setting up the machine for specific ballistic problems, optimizing its performance. Betty Jennings, alongside Kay, contributed significantly to the logical design, often working directly with the engineers to understand and adapt the hardware for their programming needs. Yet despite the undeniable intellectual rigor and groundbreaking nature of their work, it was consistently dismissed and devalued. Within the male-dominated academic and military environment, their efforts were labeled as clerical, routine operating tasks, or simply setting up the machine. The language used was crucial. Programming was not yet a recognized intellectual pursuit. It was seen as a manual, almost secretarial function, far removed from the real engineering performed by men. This allowed the true intellectual heavy lifting, the conceptualization of how to make a machine perform a series of complex abstract tasks, to be attributed elsewhere, primarily to the male engineers who designed the hardware. The institutional gatekeepers, from university administrators to military officers, perpetuated this narrative, ensuring that the glory, the patents, and the historical credit accrued to the visible male figures. How could such foundational intellectual labor, the very essence of making a machine intelligent, be so utterly dismissed and systematically devalued, simply because of who performed it, and what were the immediate tangible consequences of this intellectual theft? The dismissal wasn't merely accidental. It was systemic, a deeply ingrained pattern woven into the fabric of academic, military, and industrial patriarchy that defined mid-20th century science and technology. The immediate consequence of this devaluation was the erasure of the ENIAC programmers from public consciousness, from official histories, and crucially, from the foundational narrative of computing itself. For decades, the names of these 6 women, Kay McNulty, Betty Jennings, Betty Snyder, Marlyn Wescoff, Fran Bilas, and Ruth Lichterman, remained in the shadows, their contributions largely uncredited, even as the very methods they pioneered became the bedrock of modern computing. The injustice wasn't just personal, it was a profound distortion of scientific history, robbing an entire generation of future female innovators of inspiring role models and a true understanding of their own intellectual lineage. The evidence of their pioneering work, however, was not entirely lost, merely buried. Archival documents, including internal reports, early flowcharts, and even rare photographs where they appeared, spoke volumes about their active intellectual involvement. Oral histories, meticulously collected decades later by dedicated researchers like Kathy Kleiman, became crucial testimonies. These accounts revealed the intensity of their work, their innovative problem-solving, and their sheer brilliance. It became clear that their clerical tasks included developing the first comprehensive set of programming instructions, designing subroutines to manage the ENIAC's limited memory and processing capabilities, and inventing sophisticated debugging techniques that were far more advanced than anything the hardware engineers had conceived for software. Their innovative techniques for debugging, subroutine development, and logical problem-solving are now recognized as direct precursors to today's software engineering principles, the very bedrock upon which every app, every operating system, and every digital interaction we have today is built. The ripple effect of their work is immeasurable. When you write a line of code, design an algorithm, or troubleshoot a software bug, you are, in a very real sense, standing on the shoulders of these women. They grappled with the fundamental challenges of translating human thought into machine instruction, of making a complex piece of hardware perform a defined sequence of operations. Their struggle with ENIAC's physical programming, the plugging and unplugging of cables, the setting of switches, forced them to develop a deep, abstract understanding of logical flow and program execution. This intellectual leap was arguably more significant than the hardware itself, as it laid the conceptual framework for what would become the multi-trillion-dollar software industry. Without their initial pioneering efforts, the evolution of computing might have taken a significantly different and slower path. The long overdue reckoning for these pioneers began to gain momentum in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Historians of science, often spurred by feminist scholarship, meticulously unearthed and pieced together their stories. Documentaries like Top Secret Rosie's, The Female Computers of World War II, brought their narratives to a wider audience. Academic papers meticulously detailed their contributions, correcting decades of misattribution. In 1997, 4 of the original 6 were inducted into the Women in Technology Hall of Fame, a powerful symbolic gesture that began to restore their rightful place. Ruth Lichterman Teitelbaum and Fran Bilas Spence were honored posthumously. These belated recognitions, while vital, underscore the immense societal cost of historical erasure. How many brilliant minds were discouraged from pursuing computing, or felt their contributions were less valuable because the foundational narrative was so fundamentally skewed? Their story isn't just about reclaiming credit for 6 extraordinary women. It's a stark reminder of how history is written, who gets to write it, and why those choices profoundly shape our understanding of progress and innovation. It's a call to vigilance against the subtle and overt biases that continue to marginalize brilliant contributions, especially from women and other underrepresented groups in STEM. The legacy of the ENIAC programmers compels us to continuously question dominant narratives, to dig deeper into archival silences, and to ensure that the true architects of our technological world are finally and unequivocally remembered. Their struggle for recognition reminds us that the fight for social justice is also a fight for an accurate, inclusive history, because without it, we risk repeating the very erasures that held back progress for far too long.